Welcome to Module 17, which is titled The New Atheists. Now, I freely admit that the music and the opening image during the introduction did not fit the title for this module, The New Atheists. But if you Google The New Atheists, or if you go to Google Images and search New Atheists, you won't find anything attractive or inspirational or lovely, or let alone beautiful. Now, that in itself is not an argument against the New Atheists and what they believe, but it could be the beginning of a good argument against them and their basic stance. Okay, just who are the members of this group, the so-called New Atheists? I've mentioned them in passing in several previous modules. It's time now for us to meet the four main individuals who make up this group, dubbed by the press the New Atheists. Who were they? Well, the main four were, counterclockwise from the bottom, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, Samuel Harris, and Richard Dawkins. Let me take them individually. Christopher Hitchens. He was a British political columnist and a journalist for Atlantic magazine who later became an American citizen. Roguish and very witty, Hitchens was an interesting man. He held some rather conservative political and economic positions, but when it came to the subject of religion, he rejected any belief in God. He died of esophageal cancer last year. He had a lot of Christian friends who were praying for him, and he even acknowledged that. And in some respects, I think Christopher Hitchens was a seeker. Now, he never found what he was looking for, and again, I don't want to suggest that he was somehow a spiritualist or a spiritual man necessarily because he was seeking, but still, he was asking questions. He would talk to his Christian friends. He would ask about things like the resurrection and the Bible, and I think he was predisposed to reject anything they said, but still, from what little I know about him, he was attempting to find some answers, at least on some level. He was a seeker. But he never found any faith. He died firmly rejecting any notion that he was about to become a believer. In fact, he said, if you hear any stories about a deathbed conversion, disbelieve them. He was convinced to the very end that there was no such thing as God and that religion had no use for him. The man had a very tumultuous upbringing, and I don't want to go into armchair psychology here, but he did have a very tumultuous upbringing. He was estranged from members of his family. I can't prove this, but I think it was more of a damaged heart than a weak brain that was the biggest enemy for Christopher Hitchens and was the biggest obstacle preventing him from finding any faith in God or any belief. He was a very acerbic, very determined foe against organized religion, and so I don't want in any way to mislead you thinking, well, maybe he was just sitting on the fence. No, we have to say he was definitely opposed to organized religion in all of its forms, and if you look at some of the books that he wrote, we'll see a few titles, you'll see that he was an implacable foe against organized religion. Daniel Dennett is an American philosopher whose specialty is cognitive psychology. He's still very much with us, and he teaches at Tufts University. And his main specialty would be cognitive psychology, or how the mind works. He does a little bit, he's kind of an autodidact in terms of he's taught himself an enormous range of subjects, and he goes out on all sorts of limbs, and he writes on various different aspects of science, evolutionary biology, cognitive science. He's a widely read man, but we're going to see some problems a little bit later in this module with at least one book that he's written. Sam Harris, also an American, also a philosopher, a neuroscientist. He's probably appeared more than anybody else, with the exception of Christopher Hitchens, who's now deceased, But Sam Harris has probably appeared more than anybody else by now on cable TV. He goes on to all of the cable TV shows, from Stephen Colbert to Bill Maher to even O'Reilly. He's been on his cable TV show as well. Like Dr. Dennett, he's a philosopher who's very critical of religion, terming it a failed science in his words. The son of a Jewish mother and a Quaker father, his upbringing was entirely secular. His latest book, that just came out a few months ago, is along the lines of spirituality without religion, which is interesting in that it seems that he's cracked open the door just a bit to acknowledging the presence of the spiritual, though he would understand spirituality very differently than we do. Probably equates it with the spiritual feelings that one can experience while hiking in the mountains, or the awe-inspiring feelings of a thunderstorm, that sort of thing. But it's, in my opinion, one small step away from matter is all there is into acknowledging the existence of some dimension of the spiritual, even though he would still close the door quite securely against any form of organized religion. Richard Dawkins is not an American, nor is he a philosopher, but he's an evolutionary biologist who teaches at Oxford University. As we've seen in a previous module, evolutionary theory, as long as it admits the existence of God, there's nothing that would rule that understanding of evolution out of court, at least as far as a Catholic is concerned. As long as one holds to the existence of God beforehand, there's no reason we can't utilize the insights from evolutionary biology to explain much of the world around us. But Richard Dawkins, of course, does no such thing. He does not use evolutionary biology like that. Now, he's good on his subject, there's no denying that. But like so many scientists who want science to be able to explain everything, whenever Dr. Dawkins moves out of his field of expertise and ventures into the realm of theology, he ends up making some rather absurd statements, frankly. Now, Mr. Hitchens recently passed away, so he's no longer, obviously, a member of this group. But to call the New Atheists a group is a bit misleading. I mean, these men all had different careers, they taught at different universities, they had different aims, they come at their objections to religion from different angles. Their books came out roughly the same time, and so it was probably an invention of the media to lump them all into one group. Now, none of them believe in God, and so they didn't object to the title, and neither did they object to being lumped with these other members who thought like them in opposing religion and opposing God. But still, they're not an organized group that is working together. Instead, they were just a collection of individuals who shared a common disbelief in the existence of God. Now, while they had varying interests guiding their work, they all believed that religion is nothing but, well, frankly, sheer ignorance or superstition. It's completely irrational. And so because of this stance, none of them ever bothers with learning very much at all about theology. You know, as you've seen, Thomas Aquinas is not the easiest author to read. None of them really bothered to try to understand what Thomas Aquinas was teaching. They never expended that much mental energy. They thought they knew from the start what religion was all about. They just wrote it off as sheer ignorance, so none of them has really invested any time or energy or intellectual effort into learning what the church actually teaches, or much less really learning Thomas Aquinas. Now, they think they know everything there is to know about religion, so why bother? Why expend any kind of mental effort learning any theology? Well, let me tell you, it shows. Whenever you read anything written by these men, it becomes very obvious rather quickly into your reading experience that they don't really know much at all about theology. They're intelligent men. None of them are dummies. They are leaders in their respective fields, some of them. But they need to stick to that field. in my opinion, because whenever they venture forth from that field, that area of expertise, they end up making outrageously ridiculous statements, some of them quite offensive actually, about religion, theology, and the church. Now, besides this being a very unintellectual stance, I mean, why bother learning anything about religion? It has nothing to teach me. Why bother learning anything about theology? It has nothing to offer. Besides this being a very unintellectual stance, it's important for us to realize the fundamental flaw in this approach and the problem with this stance, and it appears all throughout their works. One can only disagree with someone if two parties have first established what it is they're disagreeing about. I mean, one can only disagree with something or someone once one has first understood it. Now, this is not my idea. This comes from Aristotle. It's at least 2,400 years old. The basis of all rational, intelligent discussion and debate and disagreement is for two people to first establish what it is under discussion. Only after doing that can two people be said to disagree with each other. One cannot really disagree with another person if you're talking about two completely different things. Disagreement, by definition, only occurs if you first have some agreed upon understanding of the matter at hand. Otherwise, we call it talking about apples and oranges. I mean, one cannot disagree with someone who loves apples by saying, I love oranges instead. I mean, in that case, you're not disagreeing about the apple or the orange. You're talking about two completely different things. This happens all the time, and you see this all throughout the writings of the New Atheists because they've never bothered to learn what the Catholic Church teaches in the first place. They don't know much about organized religion. They have their preconceived ideas. But because they've never bothered to really understand it, the things that they end up disagreeing with are things that we do not hold. And they start talking about things, objecting to certain things that we just don't believe in the first place. This happens because they just haven't bothered to do their homework. They haven't shown their respect to religion or to theology in the first place to bother learning what it has to offer. Here's a very simple example of what I mean. Here are some basic tenets of a lesser-known atheist, Stephen J. Hurlin. Now, as you look at this, notice the very definition of God that appears here, that God is some kind of physical being. This is what Mr. Hurlin assumes God is. Now, Mr. Hurlin does not have the slightest clue as to what St. Thomas Aquinas says about the nature of God. I mean, how many times in this course have you had to sit and listen to me say that God is not a being, not even the supreme being, much less a physical being? I mean, who believes in this? Nobody does. I mean, come on, the very definition of God here, before he launches into any further objections, the very definition just doesn't apply to what we believe. We do not believe in a physical being called God. So all of the arguments that he's going to amass objecting to this, it's all a house of cards. It's all going to come falling down, crumbling around him, because look at the foundation that he's basing all of his objections on, that God is some kind of physical being. I mean, I just have to throw my hands up sometimes, when you come across these guys and what they say, because what they're talking about has nothing to do with what we believe. What this guy's rebelling against is not our idea of God. It's some kind of preconceived, misunderstood idea about God, that if he would have just done a little bit more homework, he could have at least understood what we say about God before then coming up with, I guess, his arguments against it. He might have not been convinced, Mr. Hurlin, by our statements about the nature of God. He might not have been convinced by these, but at least he would have come up with better arguments, and he would have avoided making ridiculous statements like God is some kind of physical being. Okay, maybe pygmies in Africa think of God like that, but you know what? I have too much respect for pygmies in Africa to just assume that they do. I don't know what they believe. I would think that if I wanted to refute the pygmy idea of God in Africa, I would at least learn about it first before writing a book on it. Okay. The new atheists never put forth that kind of work or effort. They're already convinced that they know religion holds no value, that we're better off without it. It has nothing to offer, so why bother studying it, or why bother with any of it? But as the terrific Thomistic scholar, Dr. Dennis Turner, that you've met previously, who's now teaching at Yale, notes, he said Richard Dawkins, the great evolutionary biologist from Oxford, he said Richard Dawkins cannot manage to quote one single sentence from Thomas Aquinas accurately. He said Dawkins mangles every statement that he attributes to Aquinas. He can't even quote Aquinas correctly or even grasp what Aquinas is saying to state it, much less refute it. Okay, the other new atheists, they all make similar foundational mistakes like this. They object to ideas about God that the Catholic Church does not hold, ideas that you are becoming familiar with now, so that you'll be able to see this should you ever need a cure for insomnia and have to read some of these books. Anyway, the mistake that they're making is summed up very nicely by Father Barron. He says what they're doing is they're making a category mistake. What does Father Barron mean by this? A category mistake. It means that they are thinking of God in a completely different category than we do. They've put God in a completely different category than we do. It's a categorical mistake. It's a mistake of such of a foundational nature that everything else that's going to flow from this category mistake is just going to collapse under scrutiny because the working definitions aren't there. The basic categories are wrong. Okay, Father Barron has a short little video clip on this. Let's look at him now and learn a little bit more about this foundational error at the root of what the new atheists speculate upon, this categorical mistake about God. Here's the video.
You know, another major part of Hitchens' book has to do with arguments for God's existence. Hitchens' basic argument is God is a hypothesis that we do not need, that natural events can be explained through natural causality. He invokes, ironically enough, William of Ockham, who was a medieval friar, and his famous principle, Occam's razor. He said, when confronted with a variety of explanations for a given phenomenon, always prefer the simplest explanation. That's a good principle. Occam said, don't multiply entities unnecessarily. He meant, don't look for elaborate causes when a very simple explanation suffices. Hitchens applies Occam's razor to many of the arguments for God's existence. God is a hypothesis that we do not require. We can explain natural phenomena, we can explain the world as a whole through natural causality. I would suggest that what's going on here is a sort of category error, and it's an error made by an awful lot of the atheists. The tendency to think of God as one competing cause among many. God as one cause within the context of mechanistic causes. Let me give you an example. If you were to say, why is the weather the way it is today? So it's a cloudy, overcast day. Why is it this way? You'd say, well, it's moisture from the Gulf of Mexico, it's the way the winds are going, it's the buckling of the jet stream, and we mention all sorts of factors. And we say, well, that's an adequate explanation for the way the weather is. What wouldn't you say? You're a religious person. You wouldn't say, well, the weather's this way because the buckling of the jet stream, because moisture from the Gulf of Mexico, because of God, and because of the way the winds are blowing. Well, see, we'd smile at that because God is not one of the competing causes among many. From a mechanistic standpoint, we have sufficiently explained the weather by appealing to all these causes. We don't need to invoke God. That's true. Another example. How do you make a cherry pie? Well, you need cherries, you need starch, you need sugar, you need flour and water and the heat of the oven and the skill of the baker. Yeah, okay, that explains the cherry pie. What wouldn't a religious person say? How do you make a cherry pie? Well, you need cherries and water and God and starch and... Well, no, that's a category mistake, as though God is one of the causes among many that produces an effect. Who is God? God is not what corresponds to that kind of question, but rather to this kind of question. Why is there something rather than nothing? That's Heidegger's question. It's a philosophical question in his version. But that's fundamentally a religious question. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there this whole nexus of finite causes at all? Why are there cherries, starch, sugar, water, heat of the oven, skill of the baker at all? Why is there a world at all? Now that's a religious question. Can a Christian believe in the Big Bang? Absolutely. In a certain way, that's just an open question. How do the scientists work out the details of how the universe evolved mechanistically? Sure, this theory, this approach, that approach. In a certain way, the religious person can remain very indifferent to all that. Creation is not getting at the mechanism of how things evolve and how things relate to each other. Creation is happening now. Creation is the event by which God, here and now, is giving rise to the totality of the universe and sustaining it in existence. No one's going to claim that the book of Genesis is scientific cosmology. It's a theological meditation on the fact of creation. So again, that's a category mistake. If we read the book of Genesis as straightforward cosmology, well, you have the Big Bang and you have the Genesis. That's apples and oranges. It's simply comparing apples and oranges. And that's a mistake that the atheists will often make in their biblical interpretation. Now, why should this world, which does not contain within itself the reason for its own being, why should it exist? That's the level where we're getting at the existence of God. When religious people talk about proofs for God's existence, they're not looking at mechanistic demonstrations. They're saying the world as a totality is contingent. It's non-self-explanatory. And therefore it points finally toward that which does exist through itself. I am who I am. The God who's not a being among many, but the sheer act of being itself. Now, we can argue about this. Philosophers and theologians have argued about it for centuries, but we won't even get off the ground if we make the category mistake that so many of the atheists make, that God is one being among many. That's what God is not. Can we apply Occam's razor? Sure, we should. You don't invoke God as one cause among many to explain the weather or the evolution of species or cherry pies. I think once we make that move, we can have a better argument about God's existence.
Okay, now that we have a little bit of an understanding of one of the really critical and foundational errors that are often at play in the work of the new atheists, errors they could have avoided if they would have just learned a little bit more about even the working definition of God. Let's move beyond that and to look at a little bit more of some of the specifics from some of these men. Let's look at Dr. Daniel Dennett. One of his early books on this came out in 2006. It's titled Breaking the Spell, Religion as Natural Phenomenon. Now, it's not so much a frontal attack on religion. It's not that, although he's under absolutely no illusions of any appreciation for religion. But the subtitle gives the book away. Religion as Natural Phenomenon. In this book, Dennett attempts to explain the origin of religion using evolutionary biology of all things, suggesting that there's a natural explanation for religion, that it just evolved for certain cultural reasons, and that modern man no longer needs religion because these cultural reasons have fallen away, thereby supposedly breaking the spell of religion. He believes that evolutionary biology, in addition to explaining the origin of the species, can also somehow explain the origin of religion, that it, in his mind, can explain just about everything. Now, he offers no proof for any of this, which seems odd for a scientist to omit. I mean, scientific methodology is based on garnering proof, on establishing proof, on assembling proof, on gathering the evidence, and then using that evidence to test the working hypothesis to see if the working hypothesis is true or not. You need evidence in order to arrive at that judgment, but there's no evidence for this theory that religion has this natural evolutionary origin. And this was pointed out in a book review in the New York Times, of all places, by a man by the name of Leon Weisselter. Leon Weisselter noted this: one cannot disprove a belief unless one disproves the content of that belief. Merely offering a separate alternative explanation for something does nothing to disprove it. And that's basically what's going on here. Dr. Dennett doesn't offer any proof. He certainly doesn't engage with the content of religion. He doesn't do that in order to disprove it. Instead, he just sets all that aside and comes up with this alternative explanation that he thinks is cogent, that evolutionary biology can explain the origins of religion, but it doesn't. There's no proof for it, as was pointed out by the reviewer, who, again, I credit the New York Times, not always a friend of organized religion, but at least they published that book review. Okay, the trap that Dr. Dennett fell into in this project is the one that Pope Benedict XVI mentioned in Module 15. The problem today is people are starting to think that evolution and evolutionary theory can explain everything, that it can explain not just certain biological aspects, but that evolution can explain all sorts of cultural, religious institutions. It can explain, personal likes and dislikes. The more you start reading, a lot of what's going on right now, almost everybody, this is their default position, that somehow evolution and evolutionary theory is able to explain dieting preferences, why we are fearful when we see a spider, all kinds of things. Now again, I think evolutionary theory is a powerful one that can explain much of the material, physical world, but it can't do anything beyond that. It cannot explain the spiritual, it cannot explain the unmeasurable, it can't explain the non-physical, it can't tell you why you fall in love, it can't explain something like that, much less can it explain something that is spiritual, such as the origin of religion. Okay, Christopher Hitchens has a phrase that you see all over the internet. What is asserted without proof can be dismissed without proof. Now, okay, that's true. You can dismiss anything for whatever reason you want. Nobody is forced to believe in God. Nobody is convincing people to believe in God. You can't force somebody to do that. And no one's trying to do this. If somebody wants to be an atheist, well, it's a free country. That person is entitled to that. But if they're going to write books about Christianity, they need to engage with the content of it. They need to look at the reasons for what Christianity holds before they start writing books, or else they're going to end up making some rather absurd statements. Again, Thomas Aquinas, his proofs, they may not convince everybody, but at least Aquinas was doing the heavy intellectual work of trying to come up with reasons for the existence of God. Now, again, as we've seen, it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain the full dimension of God. It doesn't certainly explain the God of the Bible. But Aquinas thought that he was offering reasons that any rational person, once they understood these, could at least posit the existence of God. To discredit Aquinas, you have to engage with his ideas. You can't just say, well, he didn't prove anything, so I'm going to dismiss him. You can, but it's not an intellectual stance to just dismiss something without engaging with the content of it. Here's another example. Richard Dawkins. He has a very offensive, but it's quoted all the time, this line from him, that you might as well believe in some flying magical spaghetti monster, is his terminology, as believe in God, meaning that God is equally ridiculous, equally implausible, equally irrational. That's what he's communicating with that outrageous description. But again, notice the category mistake here. He assumes God is one kind of individual being. Again, they're making some very basic mistakes. They're making some foundational errors that if they just would have given religion and theology a little more respect and have tried to engage with the ideas, at least their arguments would have been sharper. Now, Dawkins published most of his ideas, including that outrageous line, in his 2000 book, The God Delusion. And in this book, Dawkins tries to do something similar to Daniel Dennett, in that Dawkins believed that he could eliminate religion by raising consciousness. Dawkins tried to present purely natural explanations for religion, claiming that mankind would be happier without it, and then he supposedly shows how religion produces more evil than good. That's some of the main lines of that book. Now, a very interesting movie to counter this was produced not by a Christian, but by Mr. Ben Stein, a very devout conservative Jew. You've seen Mr. Stein. He's been in sitcoms, he's been in movies, he's advertised Haagen-Dazs ice cream. You see him in commercials. Mr. Stein came up, he was the producer actually, for a movie called Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. Here's a video clip from that movie showing Mr. Stein interviewing Dr. Richard Dawkins on the subject of God, the creation of the universe, and some other interesting things. Here's a short video clip from that movie now.
Hello, Professor Dawkins. How are you? I'm Ben Stein. I'm so sorry to keep you waiting. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
You have written that God is a psychotic delinquent invented by mad, deluded people.
No, I didn't say quite that. I said something rather better than that.
Oh, well, please tell us what you said. Please tell us what you said.
Well, I would have to read it from the book.
No, please.
The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully.
So that's what you think of God?
Yeah.
How about if people believed in a God of infinite lovingness and kindness and forgiveness and generosity, sort of like the modern day God? Why spoil it for them?
Oh,
Why not just let them have their fun and enjoy it?
I mean, I don't want to spoil anything for anybody. I write a book, people can read it if they want to. I believe that it is a liberating thing to free yourself from primitive superstition.
So religion is a primitive
Oh,
superstition?
I think it is, yes.
So you believe it's liberating to tell people that there is no God?
I think a lot of people, when they give up God, feel a great sense of release and freedom.
Why do you think that? I mean, what's your dad? What's your scientist? What's your data?
I think, well, I've had a lot of letters saying that, and I've...
There are 8 billion people in the world, Dr. Dawkins. How many letters have you had?
No, I haven't done that. That's quite true.
Professor Dawkins seemed so convinced that God doesn't exist that I wondered if he would be willing to put a number on it.
Well, it's hard to put a figure on it, but I mean, I'd put it as something like, 99% against or something.
Well, how do you know it's 99%
I
against,
don't.
say, not 97%?
No, I did. You asked me to put a figure on it, and I'm not comfortable putting a figure on it. I think I just think it's very unlikely.
What? But you couldn't put a number on it?
No, of course not. No.
So it could be 49%.
Well, it would be. I mean, I think it's unlikely, but it's quite far from 50%.
How do you know?
I don't know. I mean, I put an argument in the book.
Well, then who did create the heavens and the earth?
Why do you use the word who? You see, you immediately beg the question by using the word who.
Well, then how did it get created?
Well, by a very slow process.
Well, how did it start?
Nobody knows how it started. We know the kind of event that it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life.
And what was that?
It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule.
Right, and how did that happen?
I told you we don't know.
So you have no idea how it started?
No, nor has anybody.
Nor has anyone else. What do you think is the possibility that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or in evolution?
It could come about in the following way. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very, very high level of technology and designed a form of life that they seeded onto perhaps this planet. Now, that is a possibility and an intriguing possibility. And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe.
Well,
but that higher intelligence would itself have had to have come about by some explicable or ultimately explicable process. It couldn't have just jumped into existence spontaneously. That's the point.
So Professor Dawkins was not against intelligent design, just certain types of designers, such as God.
So the Hebrew God, the God of the Old Testament, he doesn't exist in your view?
Certainly, I mean, that would be a very unpleasant prospect.
And the Holy Trinity of the New Testament, that doesn't
nothing
exist.
like that.
Do you believe in any of the Hindu gods? Like Vishnu?
How can you
or-
ask such a question?
You
I mean,
don't, right?
How could I? I
Do
mean,
you believe
why
in-
would I, given that I don't believe in any others?
You don't believe in the Muslim God?
No. And why do you even need to ask?
Well, I just wanted to be sure. So you don't believe in any God anywhere?
Any God anywhere would be completely incompatible with anything that I've said
I assume.
yeah.
I just wanted to make sure. You don't believe in any God anywhere?
No.
What if after you died you ran into God? He said, "What have you been doing, Richard? I mean, what have you been doing? I've been trying to be nice to you.
Yeah.
I gave you a multi-million-dollar paycheck over and over again with your book, and look what you did."
Bertrand Russell had that point put to him, and he said something like, "Sir, why did you take such pains to hide yourself?"
But if the intelligent design people are right, God isn't hidden. We may even be able to encounter God through science, if we have the freedom to go there. What could be more intriguing than that?
Okay, Dr. Richard Dawkins is a very bright man, and he's an outstanding, very accomplished evolutionary biologist, but he should stick to biology, in my opinion. Mr. Ben Stein, who does not teach at Oxford, I think did a very fine job of highlighting some critical errors in the approach that Dawkins has in this book. Again, science can only measure the observable. Science doesn't know anything about what happened before there was a measurable world, something that Mr. Stein pointed out. He at least got Richard Dawkins to say, "I don't know about something," and let me tell you, that doesn't happen very often. But because the new atheists are so convinced religion just has, so little merit, actually probably zero merit for it, going for it, they just don't bother to learn anything about it. Okay, instead of a scientific argument that we saw from Dawkins, or how about a different argument from Mr. Hitchens? It's commonly referred to as the secularization thesis. Mr. Hitchens utilized this argument quite a bit in his 2007 book, God is Not Great. It's an obvious slam against Islam, but really it's equally offensive to just about everybody who believes in God. The title of his book is God is Not Great. And in this book, he utilizes this secularization thesis, which basically says the more modernity spreads, the more reason and education spread, the more diffuse they become, the more the modern world spreads, the more secular it becomes, the more religion vanishes. Now, this is not a new idea at all. This is not one that Mr. Hitchens came up with. This is a very rather old idea, actually, rather tired one in my opinion. It comes from the 17th century. It comes from the Enlightenment. It was basically coming out of, thinkers like Voltaire, who he wasn't an atheist exactly. He was more of a deist, but he was very much opposed to organized religion, Voltaire was. And Auguste Comte, he definitely was an atheist. But these two men, especially during the Enlightenment, come up with this secularization thesis that the more education, the more reason, the more modernity spreads, the more religion will just fade away and it will just lose its hold on people's imagination, the more it's replaced with reason and knowledge and that sort of thing. Now again, this idea has been around for centuries. It is not a new idea. We've had it with us long enough for us to test it. And surprisingly, this idea, the secularization thesis, it just doesn't hold water. John Micklethwaite, writing against the secularization thesis, notes this in his book, God is Back, how the global revival of faith is changing the world. He notes this. He observed this. He said, wherever there is plurality of religions and wherever there is free choice, religion thrives. Now, plurality and choice are two very modern ideas. These are both characteristic of the modern world. And he says it's not when modernity spreads that religion fades. He says wherever there is plurality of choice and wherever there is freedom of choice with respect to religion, wherever there's more than one religion offered, he said religion actually thrives. It doesn't fade away. It doesn't just thrive in the Australian outback. It thrives in the first world. It thrives in the modern world when there is plurality, many religions, and there's a freedom to choose between them. Now, there are places in the modern world where religion does seem to be on the decline. In places like England, in parts of Germany, in Scandinavia, and one could even point to mass attendance in central Italy. What's going on here? Well, Micklethwaite notes that these are areas that historically were subject to a state church. These were areas where there were, historically at least, there were not things like plurality or many religions or freedom of choice. In England, there was a state church after the Reformation, the Anglican Church. And so because there was no plurality, if you weren't a subscriber to the Anglican creed, you were labeled a dissenter. And that's what the Puritans, that's why they left England to come here, is because they were not allowed to practice their religion in England under the state-sanctioned Anglican Church. So wherever there's a state-imposed church, that's where religion seems to be on the decline today. England had a state religion, the Anglican Church, and so today there are more Catholics that go to Mass in England on any given Sunday than there are Anglicans attending Anglican services. Why? Because the state religion historically just did not allow for any choice. Religion suffers. The same is true in the Scandinavian countries, where the Lutheran Church, not the Anglican there, but the Lutheran Church was the state-imposed church. And so in Scandinavia, it has one of the lowest rates of people attending Sunday services because there was this state-imposed Lutheran church there. Same thing in Germany. In Germany, not just a state-imposed church, but in Germany, this is what you have to do today. You have two choices. You can check either the box that says you're a Lutheran, or you check the box that says you're a Catholic. And those are your two choices. And then, not only do you have to check that choice, you are then forced to pay taxes to either church, to the Lutheran Church or to the Catholic Church. That's the setup in Germany. And so the decline for the practice of religion in Germany, it's not because Germany's this modern world and so, the more reason spreads, the more religion's on decline in Germany. No, people are leaving the church, the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church both in Germany, because it's an imposed situation. They are forced to pay taxes. And so people don't want to pay the taxes. They're not checking the boxes. They're not going to church. In Germany, where, again, there's no plurality and there's no choice. It's something that's imposed on them, and people are just reacting against that. It's understandable. Same thing even in Italy. Around Rome and up in central Italy, they used to be part of the papal states. There was a state-imposed church, the Catholic Church, and people in the papal states had to pay taxes to support the papal government. It's not surprising that mass attendance in those parts of Italy are lower than up in northern Italy, which had a different monarch and did not have the same kind of imposition laid upon the backs of the citizens up there. It's a fascinating thesis, I think. Now, it's a complicated issue. It's not like that's the only explanation. Sure, the modern world brings lots of challenges. There's so much convenience. There's so many luxuries. There are so many reasons why the modern world can sap religion. But let's not pretend it's the old 17th century idea that Mr. Hitchens trots out in his book, that the more reason spreads, the more education spreads, the more religion fades. That's not the case. Look at this country. Religion is booming in America. There's no more modern world than the United States of America, and yet religion is thriving here. Why? Because there are so many choices. There's a plurality of religions here, and people are free to choose. And not only that, it is because of the separation of church and state. Now I want to say something just on this topic very briefly. Friends, I think the separation of church and state has been a tremendous blessing for us here in the United States. I used to think differently as a young man. I used to think, oh, that somehow slights religion, or that somehow relegates religion to a second-class status. I don't think it does anything of the sort now. The separation of church and state, it's what allows religion to thrive here. People can choose to be whatever religion they want. And the state is not imposing a religion on us. Because there's no state-imposed or state-sanctioned religion here, look at how well religion is doing in the United States. The separation of church and state has been a gift to us. It is not an inhibition or a restriction. And especially, I don't want to become some bleak prognosticator now and say, what's going to happen 5 or 10 years down the road or later. But should government ever become more antagonistic toward religion in this country? We have had such a long precedent, such a long history of jurisprudence on the separation of church and state. It's so interwoven into American civil polity that I think it's going to serve us well. That should government ever become more antagonistic, we have this bulwark against government intrusion called the separation of church and state. I know it's been hotly debated over the HHS mandate on contraception, but I think the Supreme Court is upholding us, and I think it will uphold us on this issue. Now, I may have to re-record this part of a module later on should the Supreme Court not uphold this, but it's such a time-honored and respected legal precedent, the separation of church and state. I think it serves us very well in this country. I do not see it at all as a hindrance or a limitation. It allows religion to thrive here. Okay, the last original member of the New Atheists is Sam Harris, who first came to prominence in 2006 with his book Letter to a Christian Nation, which didn't really add that much that was different to what I've presented above. But again, in his latest book, he mentions some opening to the spiritual dimension. Now, this is a little surprising. I don't want to overread it and think, oh, he's on a spiritual journey now, or he's taking steps towards reversing some of his earlier positions. He's still very much opposed to organized religion. He makes that very clear. But I think I think it's a positive thing that overall he's carving out some space for an acknowledgement of something beyond just the material world around us, that he's acknowledging the existence and the value, muted as it may be, that there's some value to the spiritual dimension, again, although he understands it very differently than you and I do. And again, he's still very much, unfortunately, an opponent of organized religion. Okay, I think if the New Atheists had done a little bit more work trying to understand some of the basic ideas that we hold about the existence of God, it might not have changed their minds, might not have converted them, but I think it would have supplied them with some better arguments than the ones that they currently utilize. I don't think that there's anything really in the New Atheists that is all that new, frankly, and this might be a strange point to make, but the 19th century atheists, I think, were all better thinkers, and I'm not siding with them, but I think there were much more powerful arguments coming from the atheists of the 19th century than coming from those of the late 20th century and the early 21st century in this group called the New Atheists. I think the arguments from the older atheists are actually a little bit more cogent. I think there are obviously rebuttals to all of those, but when you read the arguments of the New Atheists, you just don't even feel like there's much of a need to rebut anything. They're just talking about something that has nothing to do with us to begin with their misunderstanding of the nature of God. One thing they do keep bringing up, and it is a much more powerful argument, but it's not something they discovered. It's the argument for the existence of moral evil. I mentioned this in the previous module. I want to say just a little bit about moral evil. I think Thomas Aquinas has given a pretty good explanation for why the evil of suffering happens in this world that God created. I don't want to rehash all of that here. I think Aquinas has given some pretty good reasons explaining that kind of thing. But the evil of the Holocaust, the darker evil, the moral evil, the existence of that, which is different from the evils of suffering and the evils of natural disaster, that's a different thing, or a different, I don't want to call it a thing, that's a different question. The question of moral evil. The New Atheists utilize it all the time. It's not something they came up with. It's been around for millennia. It goes all the way back to the time of Job. The question of the presence of this moral evil and the question of God. It's one that's important enough to require just a few comments in this module. Now, I'm under no illusions that in the next 10 minutes I'm going to be able to clear this one up. I mean, we've had it for thousands of years, and still we don't have the easy answer to this, so you're not going to have the easy answer for me in the next 10 minutes. But I will say this about the problem of moral evil. It's not something I can solve, and I admit that. Because again, this kind of evil does not have any reason to it. There's no rationality to it. There's no intelligibility for us to somehow discover about it. It's an absence. It's a lack of reason, a lack of goodness. That's what moral evil is. It's non-being, and no one can make sense of non-being, not even God. Okay, if that's what evil is. The questions that surround this, you've heard them all before. Why doesn't God do something about it? Why didn't God do something about the Holocaust? Why didn't he stop it? Why doesn't God do something about the horrible things, the moral evils that happen around us all the time? With gang violence in inner city, you can list all the kinds of moral evils around us as easily as I can. Now, what's going on here with this, why doesn't God do something about this? Can you detect the idea under the surface? This question, why doesn't God do something about this moral evil? under the surface, it sounds like God is being reduced to some kind of individual, even supreme being, some kind of individual divinity who's charged with negligence or derelict of duty. The great Father Herbert McCabe puts it like this in his book, God and Evil. We human beings just cannot charge God, we cannot accuse God as if God were some individual being in the universe. We cannot use language against God as if God were beholden to us, if God were responsible to us, as if we could put God on trial like we could some other person, as if God were just another being in the universe and we were calling him to account. We can't do that. Language, human language, cannot be raised up against God, not as if God were subject to our evaluation. Not for the last time, but for almost the last time, I'm going to say God is not just this individual being up there. Any individual being that we could conceive of that could be answerable to us, that's not who God is. Here we can see that Father McCabe, Thomas Aquinas, Job are all saying pretty much the same thing. There's just no explaining the existence of evil. We cannot explain this. We are called to fight against it. We are to oppose it. We cannot make sense of it. But there's no explaining it. It's nonsense. That's what evil is. But neither can we call God to task in order to answer to us for this as if God were our errand boy. Now, the proper stance for we who believe cannot be improved upon that of Job in that magnificent book from the Old chapters 38 to 40 in particular, the climax, really, of one of the greatest achievements of the human race, the book of Job, produced by a genius, the equal of Shakespeare, who also happened to be inspired by God. Toward the end of this magnificent book, after all the questions, after all the back and forth between Job and his so-called friends, after all the searching for answers and explanations, after looking for reasons for suffering and for evil, and after demanding that God account for all of the above, we get this. From God to Job now. God says this in chapter 38, "Gird up your loins now like a man, and I will question you. And you, Job, you tell me the answers. Where were you when I founded the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its size? Do you know?" And on God goes throughout chapter 38, questioning Job to see if Job can answer even one question from God, which of course Job cannot. God ends his discourse by asking out loud, "Will we have arguing with the Almighty by the critic?" Meaning you, Job? Are you going to criticize me? Let him who would correct God give the answer. And here, what Job says next is just so profound. Job answers. He gives the best possible answer, the truest answer, the only answer that there is to the question of God and evil. Job says this in chapter 40, verse 4. "Behold, I am of little account. What can I answer you? I put my hand over my mouth. Though I have spoken once, I will not do so again. Though twice, I will do so no more." Here, I believe, is the correct stance for us to take when it comes to the question of God and moral evil. Now, I know it's not an answer. I know it's not an explanation. But remember what evil is. It's a lack of anything intelligible or reasonable. There is ultimately no answer that I can come up with or that the human mind can come up with in answer to the problem of moral evil. But the new atheists, of course, would not accept this. The fact that I can give no answer, no explanation, they would laugh at this. They think eliminating God is somehow better than the stance of Job and Aquinas, who out of humility recognize who God is and who we are in relation to him. But this is the stance that I will take. It's not an answer. It's not an explanation, I know that. I think it's so much better than either. I think this stance, the stance of Job, is one of faith seeking understanding. It's not faith seeking proof. It's not faith seeking the definitive response. It's not faith seeking an easy answer. It's faith seeking understanding. We understand who God truly is, and we understand who we are in relation to God. And when we have that kind of faith-filled stance, we do not fall back into questions such as, well, God, why didn't you do something? And now, God, you answer to us. The faith that we have is the faith of Job, and it's the faith that realizes there are limitations to the human mind and to human language, and to address ourselves to God like that is to depart from the stance of faith. This kind of stance recognizes who God and we truly are. So why doesn't God do something about moral evil? I do not have a philosophical answer to this most philosophical of questions, I freely admit it. Instead of a philosophical answer, which can't be had, and we know now why, because there's no reason that can explain the unreasonable. Instead of a philosophical answer, I want to leave you with this. This is my response. To the question, why doesn't God do something about evil? I can only point to Jesus Christ on the cross and say that God has done everything a good and loving God can do. God himself has suffered evil for our sakes so that we will not have to ourselves. The question is not, why doesn't God do something about evil? God has. God has done more than enough. God has given us his only Son to suffer evil so we don't have to. The question in the end isn't why doesn't God do something about this kind of evil, about moral evil. The real question is, why don't we? Thank you for your attention on this module. There is a reading assignment for you on your syllabus, and a threaded discussion question awaits. Just one more module. I will look for you then. Until then, goodbye and good